Welcome to Off the Page. It's great to be with you. For 8 centuries, an improbable encounter between St. Francis of Assisi and Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil during the Fifth Crusade has been a north star for inter-religious dialogue. Christians tend to focus on Francis in this story, but the Sultan's role is equally important, if not more so. The unlikely, beautiful relationship that formed between these two men more than 800 years ago can continue to be a model for peacemaking and dialogue today in a world that seems as if it is becoming increasingly polarized and divided. You are in for a treat with this episode, and I'm so thrilled to introduce to you our next guest, Father Michael Calabria, a friar in Our Lady of Guadalupe Province and director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at St. Bonaventure University. A few things about Father Michael. His experience in the Middle East and the Islamic world began more than 40 years ago when, as an Egyptology student at Johns Hopkins University and Brown University, he performed archaeological work in Egypt. After studying library science at Columbia and working as an academic librarian in New York City, he entered the Franciscan Order in 1996 and studied at Washington Theological Union. As a friar, he lived in Cairo in 2001 to 2002, ministering in a leprosarium. In between 2003 to 2011, he spent many summers in Egypt teaching English at a Coptic Catholic seminary in Cairo. Father Michael became a professor at St. Bonaventure University in 2003, where he began teaching courses in Arabic and then Islamic Studies. After completing his doctorate in Islamic Studies with the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter in England, he inaugurated the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at St. Bonaventure University, where he continues to teach today. His 2022 book, The Language of the Taj Mahal, analyzed the Qur'anic inscriptions on India's iconic monument and was featured in a recent documentary, Islam's Greatest Stories of Love. He was also a contributor to a 2016 documentary about St. Francis's meeting with the Sultan titled The Sultan and the Saint. This conversation went a little longer, so I have not provided reflection segments throughout this episode. However, Father Michael says so many thought-provoking things throughout the conversation that I invite you to pause the episode whenever something strikes you and to take some time to allow it to sink deeper into your heart. I've provided a few closing quotes at the end of the episode to contemplate and meditate upon. And as always, check out the show notes of this episode for more resources and opportunities to reflect on this episode's content. So, without further ado, here is our next guest, Father Michael Calabria. Enjoy. Father Michael Calabria, welcome to Off the Page.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So the story about St. Francis of Assisi journeying to Egypt to meet the Sultan, it's a popular one. Can you begin by sharing this story and then also providing some background about what was happening during that time period?
Okay, how much time do we have now?
As much as you want. I love this story.
It is a great story, and it is, I think, an inspirational one, not only for Franciscan friars, for the larger Franciscan family, but indeed all people of faith. And it's because Francis was acting in a way that was what we would call today countercultural. So just to give you some background, we're talking about the early 13th century. The church is still interested in reconquering Jerusalem. It, of course, had defeated the Muslims, the Muslim forces at Jerusalem in 1099, but had lost Jerusalem to Salah ad-Din in 1187, had lost Jerusalem, but had not given up hope of taking the city back. And so in 1213, Pope Innocent III issues an encyclical called Quia Maior, because it's important, is how we would translate that. And he paints a rather apocalyptic view of the world at the time. In his view, the world is in the end times, and this is now the final battle between the forces of good and evil. And he identifies Islam as the beast spoken about in the book of Revelation. So his language is rather inflammatory. The text is rather harsh. I don't quote it often because it's just it's really tough language. Um, and that becomes the basis. That encyclical becomes the basis for the Fifth Crusade at the Lateran Council. And the idea is to attack Egypt rather than attacking Jerusalem first. Egypt is at this point part of the Ayyubid Sultanate. That is the sultanate that was established by Salah ad-Din. And Cairo is one of the major capitals of the Ayyubid Sultanate, the other one being Damascus. So the Ayyubid Sultanate extends its authority over Egypt, all of Syria, Palestine, up north, really into what is now northern Iraq and southern Turkey. So it's a sultanate of considerable power, wealth, and expanse. So the idea is to attack Egypt and in this way rob the sultanate of its economic power. So the Crusaders became very much aware that part of their struggle was that the sultanate was a wealthy one. And as long as it had wealth, it could keep up the fight. And so the object of the crusade is the city of Damietta, which is a port city on the Mediterranean in the northeastern part of the Egyptian delta. And it is really the gateway into Egypt and down to Cairo. And all of the commercial trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, if you were having any dealings with the Ayyubids, would pass through Damietta on way to Cairo by the Nile. So the idea is if the Crusaders can capture Egypt, then they cut off the flow of income to the Ayyubid Sultanate and will therefore be in a better position to seize Jerusalem. So that's the foundation, if you will, of this crusade.
Okay, yeah. Now I'm curious. The encyclical that you mentioned, that was apocalyptic, I think is the word you used.
Yes.
Was the Pope did he raise the temperature in the room, or was he kind of following what previous popes had done in previous crusades?
I think that this raised the temperature quite a bit
Okay.
because, again, he is trying to, of course, inspire Christians to join the crusade. I mean, there was no real draft unless you threatened to excommunicate people, which occasionally the papacy resorted to. But I think this was a really concerted attempt to gather support for this crusade by appealing to people's faith in a way, in a very serious way. I mean, if you're talking about this is the end of the world, folks, if you're framing this endeavor using the book of Revelation, that's a very serious way of framing the story here.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Like you've painted a very good picture of what the climate was at that time, and how differing people viewed one another as well.
Indeed.
Where does Francis come in?
Francis arrives in Damietta in August of 1219. So the crusading armies have already landed in Egypt in the previous year. Francis comes, and he is in the midst of a terrible situation because the Crusaders have been at this for quite some time without gaining much ground. And there has been have been battles fought between the crusading army and the Sultanate, but not much ground has been gained. So this is war in a very ugly way, and so Francis is entering into real ministry. It's important to realize, as part of our background, that for the Muslims in Egypt, this was a bit of an oddity because the Sultanate had commercial dealings with various city-states in Italy. There were commercial agreements that were renewed periodically. So it wasn't like Europeans were unknown at the time. They were present, particularly merchants were present, some diplomats as well. And so when the fleet of the Crusaders arrives on the Egyptian coast, it's a bit of a puzzlement. Why are they attacking when we have commercial relations with various European Christians? So Francis arrives there in 1219 at a very, very difficult time, not only for the Crusaders because they're the ones that are initiating the battle, but also for the Sultanate because the Sultan al-Adil, who was in Damascus, died before he could get to Cairo. But he was aware of the crusading army, and so he sends word to his son that be careful because this is coming your way and you're going to need to step up and attend to the defense of the Sultanate. So that happened soon after the crusading armies arrived. So when Francis arrives there, basically a year later, he's in the midst of a lot of activity going on. His idea, from everything that we know about Francis, must have been, we can say that I think with a great deal of certainty, must have been to bring an end to a terrible conflict. Francis was no stranger to warfare. We know this, right? That he himself fought in the battles between Assisi and Perugia, was taken captive, spent time as a prisoner of war. So he knows the horrors. I mean, he's seen childhood friends killed in battle. He has suffered as a prisoner himself. So his idea seems to have been from the beginning to meet with the Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil, who had to assume control of Egypt after his father died. And Francis's belief probably was that if he could meet with the Sultan and preach to the Sultan, then perhaps the Sultan would relinquish the Jerusalem, would relinquish his rule, maybe embrace Christianity. But from everything we know about Francis, there must have been the objective of bringing an end to a conflict where lives were being lost on both sides. We don't know what Francis said to the Sultan. We don't have any direct script, if you will, of what was exchanged between the two. But here's an interesting item. We know that in September of 1219, Francis meets with Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil. Sometime after that meeting, we know that al-Kamil makes an offer of peace with the crusading camp. Several offers, in fact. He offers the Crusaders Jerusalem and Palestine. He offers them control of the holy city. He said he will tear down the walls of the city so that the city won't be able to resist. And yet, those offers of peace, of bringing this conflict to an end, were rejected by the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius. So the question then becomes, why? Isn't the objective to win back the holy city, to
Right.
take control of the
Yeah.
holy city? Isn't that the
Yep.
whole objective of the
Yep.
crusade? No, because the encyclical of Innocent was the complete destruction of Islam. Because of the way that the Pope had framed the conflict, this was a battle to the end, to destroy evil from the face of the earth, as revealed by the book of Revelation. So for him, it was not, for the Pope, and neither for Pelagius was it working out some kind of deal with the Sultanate. It was the utter destruction of the Sultanate and of all Muslims if necessary. So it was a pretty brutal kind of position to take. And there is Francis, trying to bring some conclusion to this through a peaceful encounter. Now, we don't know what they talked about, but we can say with certainty what Francis didn't say. He did not in any way say anything that defamed or degraded the Prophet of Islam or the faith itself, because he wouldn't have left the Sultan's camp in peace had he done so. We know what the Franciscan friars did in Morocco. Father Berard and companions went into the mosque in Marrakesh and said horrible things about the Prophet Muhammad, about Islam, and they ultimately lost their lives. Francis did not take that tactic. He apparently spoke in a way that engendered respect from the Sultan and from the courtiers. We know somewhat of what Francis said from Jacques de Vitry, who was the Bishop of Acre, and he said that the Muslims willingly listen to the friars as long as they don't insult the Prophet. So Francis spoke in a way that wasn't considered threatening or disrespectful. And I think that's what's unique about the situation, because all of the other language from the crusading camp at this time, from the papacy, is very inflammatory and very insulting, and again is not looking for some kind of peace or reconciliation. It's looking for the utter destruction of Islam and its adherents. So Francis brings something else to this equation. The other half of that, though, is the person of the Sultan himself.
Yep.
And I think this is what people miss when they tell the story. I think it's quite frankly what a lot of friars miss when they tell the story. So we tell the story about Francis and the Sultan, but really we're telling the story of Francis. We're not
Yes.
telling the
Yep.
story of the Sultan. And so what do we know about the Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil? Well, first of all, we know that he's an intelligent person. We have artifacts. We have celestial globes that were made for him, which are these wonderful creations. They're not globes of the world, but they're globes of the constellations and the stars as they would appear if you were looking down towards the earth, which I find fascinating. So there's a sophisticated science and astronomy behind this. He's an intelligent person. He's a literate person. And we know he is a spiritual person. What do I mean by that? We know that al-Malik al-Kamil is drawn to the mystical traditions in Islam called Sufism. We know that he had a particular regard, affection for a poet named Ibn al-Farid, a direct contemporary of Francis. And we have these actually amusing stories of the lengths that al-Malik al-Kamil went to try to meet this poet, Ibn al-Farid. When we look at the poetry of Ibn al-Farid, I see there a lot of commonalities with what we would identify as Franciscan spirituality. Ibn al-Farid talks about experiencing God through all the phenomenon of nature. He talks about the dew on the grass. He talks about the scent of flowers, the feel of walking in a field of flowers. And he says that all of these things are conveying his beloved to him. And he's talking about his God. So this is part of the spirituality of the Sultan. And so I wonder, as the Sultan listened to Francis, of course, speaking through interpreters, did the Sultan think of his own Sufi poet, Ibn
Hmm.
al-Farid? Was he thinking that this Franciscan guy, this Italian guy, is very much Sufi-like? Even in his appearance, if you think about Francis's appearing wearing a patched habit, and we know that Francis wore this habit where holes have been patched over. This is very much the garment of the Sufis. They wear these patched garments. They are itinerant preachers living very simple lives. So the Sultan would have had an experience of Sufism, of this mystical tradition and Islam. And I think that when Francis spoke, it actually evoked in the Sultan his own spirituality through his own faith, that is, of course, Islam. So I think really the success of the encounter, and I do believe it was a successful encounter ultimately, is that two men of faith met and could see in the other a believer.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah. A couple questions about the meeting itself. The first one's really simple. This was bizarre, correct? I mean, it's not like Francis was some diplomat, who
No,
was sent by Rome to go negotiate. I mean, he's kind of a weirdo, right? He goes on
he's
this journey
uh
and yeah.
yeah, he's a bit off the wall. I mean, he's off the wall in the simple way that he's not talking about let's go kill,
Yeah. That's the
right?
countercultural aspect that you hit on at the beginning. Yeah. Yep.
Exactly. I mean, he's there in the midst of warfare, and everyone is trying to figure out how can we accomplish this task and then get out of here,
Hmm.
right? Let's win the battle, let's kill the people that we need to kill, and then we're out of here, right? Because you're not talking about a professional army per se, you're talking about volunteers, really. So, yeah, Francis is acting in a way that is at odds. It's at odds with the church of
Yeah.
his. I mean, and that's an important consideration. The church has said, come and join this fight to eliminate this beast that has been described in the Holy Scriptures, in the book of Revelation, the beast marked with 666, which he identifies, I'm sorry to say, with the Prophet Muhammad. So Francis is acting oddly, he's acting counterculturally, he's acting, you could say, counter ecclesially.
Hmm.
Although Francis doesn't make make a scandal out of the fact that he is attempting to do what the church was not interested in doing. It was only begrudgingly that the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius, allowed Francis to cross the enemy lines to meet with the Sultan.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and I've heard people say before that Francis was probably trying to convert the Sultan. Is that true, or?
I think Francis's motivation was for evangelization
Yeah.
because Francis evangelized. His primary evangelization was amongst Christians, right? He's calling people to lead a more authentically Christian life in the manner of Jesus Christ. So Francis was an evangelist. He's going to evangelize wherever he was. That's who he was,
Yep.
right? So I don't think we should be surprised that that was Francis's motivation. I'm sure he felt that if the Sultan converted to Christianity, became a Christian, we could bring an end to this.
Yeah.
Besides, Francis is a man of the Middle Ages. He's not a Vatican II Catholic, right?
Right.
He doesn't know Nostra Aetate.
Yep.
And, right? I mean, we have to think realistically about Francis. Francis is a man of the Middle Ages. He has been taught all of his life the only means of salvation is through your faith in Jesus Christ in the one holy Roman Catholic Church, period. Right? So anyone who is not in communion with the church, anathema est, they are consigned to the flames of hell. Certainly that was, I have no doubt that that was his motivation. He's going to preach because he always preached. He preached to the birds, to the fish, right? He preached to everything and everyone. So I think the fish was Anthony, but Francis preached to the birds. I think his motivation was to evangelize. I think he expected that he would be killed.
That's what I was going to ask you about next, is where does martyrdom come into play here? Yeah.
I don't think he sought martyrdom. I think that's hagiography. I think within the context of the Middle Ages, good and holy people sought martyrdom wherever they could find it. That was the mark of holiness, to be killed for your faith. I think he probably expected it. Remember that Francis has no knowledge of Islam. He has no knowledge of Muslims. He only knows what he's been told by the church, by people who had come back from the Crusades, etc. So he's listening to all of this very prejudicial, inflammatory speech about these people, who are amongst the evil of the world, etc., etc., etc. He knows that there have been Christian martyrs in Islamic lands. So he probably thought, okay, I'm going to go and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. If I lose my life, so be it. Of course, I think he was trying to bring about some kind of peaceful resolution. Everything about this man, everything that we know about Francis before going to Egypt says this is a man who tries to end conflict, not foster conflict, to bring people together rather than separate people. So I think he felt that in some way, shape, or form, he could be instrumental in bringing peace. The outcome, I think, is that Francis and the Sultan see in one another people of real faith. And I think when we talk about the conversion of the Sultan, I think Francis himself was converted. That his kind of spiritual horizons were expanded, perhaps blown open by what he heard coming from his Muslim hosts, from the Sultan and perhaps the people around him as well. this was the first time that Francis would have spoken to a Muslim. And probably, I would think that the Sultan spoke to Francis about his own faith as much as Francis spoke about his faith. So I think it was really a meeting of hearts and minds, that the two looked at one another, listened to one another, and heard something they hadn't expected.
Hmm. That's very well put. Do we know how many days they spent together?
We don't. The accounts
Yeah.
aren't consistent. It could be a couple of days, a couple of weeks. We don't know. So yeah, there's a lot of room there
Yeah.
for
Okay.
interpretation and understanding. But I truly, well, we know this had an impact on Francis. We know this had an impact on Francis because of Francis's writings after his return to Italy.
Can you get into that really quick?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, of course, Francis, when he gets back from his time in Egypt, he is not there. Apparently, when the city of Damietta falls, he probably takes off after. He's not interested in seeing, the spoils of war or any of that. So he returns to Italy and writes his earlier, what we call the earlier rule for the friars, the rule of 1221. And in that rule, of course, is a chapter on the friars who go on mission to Muslim lands, right? So this is a very important aspect of the life of a friar minor. And Francis writes in chapter 16 of the rule, as for the brothers who go, they can live spiritually among the Saracens, that is the Muslims, and non-believers in two ways. One way is not to engage in arguments or disputes, but to be subject to every human creature for God's sake. The other way is to announce the word of God when they see it pleases the Lord. Now, that's really fascinating. It's fascinating because Francis's first admonition here to friar missionaries is, when you are amongst the Muslims, don't engage in argumentation. You're not having a theological debate, okay? You're not engaging in some kind of scholastic academic exercise. That's not what the friar minor is to do when he's on mission. And he uses language that, again, is in contrast to the language of the church, where Francis says, be subject to every human creature for God's sake. That is against the church's teaching. A Christian should not be subject to Muslims, says the church. And yet Francis is saying, your way of evangelizing, your way of preaching the gospel is by the manner in which you relate to people, relate to the Muslims as someone who is subject and servant to them.
Hmm.
And he says, you announce the word of God when you see that it pleases the Lord. In other words, that requires discernment. That requires discernment. You're not simply to start shooting off your mouth. That's what the friars in Morocco did, and they lost their lives for it. Francis is talking about witnessing to his gospel call by the way he relates to people. And, I mean, let's face it, he's a man of the gospel. He wants to preach, but he's going to preach through discernment, by going through a process of discernment, and by preaching in a way that is going to build the kingdom of God, not tear it apart. And certainly using inflammatory, disrespectful language is not the way Francis interacted with people, even with people that he disagreed with. That's not Francis's way of relating to people.
Yeah, you're a scholar, so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this, but have you ever seen that quote from Francis? And I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and look. I came across it in my studies at FST, but he says something along the lines of, I want to gather up all the names of God and place them in the holiest places. And is that a reference to Islam, or is that too far of a
I
scholastic kind
think
of leap? Or, yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about. So there is a story about Francis who is picking up scraps of paper. And someone asks him, why are you doing this? These are the writings of the pagans.
Mm,
And pagan is a medieval term for Muslims, actually. Um, and Francis says that where the name of God is written, it is to be revered, even if it's amongst the writings of the pagans. So for Francis, there's a faith that transcends differences.
hmm. Yeah, it's beautiful. You hit on this a little bit earlier. You have a PhD in Islamic Studies, and you're the
Yes.
director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at St. Bonaventure University. And you got into something really important, and that is how Sultan Malik al-Kamil often gets left out of this,
Mhm.
and we just focus so much on Francis. So I'm
Right.
curious, how has your study of Islam enriched this story for you?
Yeah, I think it's well, in a number of ways. And this is a project that I've been working on, so I'll share it with your audience.
Please.
Um, this uh, notion that Francis comes up with, or this MO, this tactic that Francis comes up with in his rule, where he says, "Do not engage in arguments or disputes." There is a verse in the Quran which instructs Muslims not to engage in arguments with the peoples of the book, that is, with Jews and Christians, but say to them, "We believe in that which has been revealed to us and which has been revealed to you, to our God and your God. He is one, and to him do we submit." So in Islam,
Mm,
you have this idea of you don't really build a community of believers by haranguing people and insulting them and threatening them with hellfire and damnation. I mean, that's one tactic, I suppose. But isn't it a better tactic to invite people into conversation where they don't feel threatened, but meet you at a very different level? I think this is what happened between Francis and the Sultan. Francis was not there to negotiate a peace treaty. He was not there to hammer out details about, who would have what land and whatnot. He's there as a man of faith. And he speaks as a man of faith. He's not speaking as a politician. He's not speaking as a diplomat. He's not speaking really as an agent of the church. That was Cardinal Pelagius. Francis is simply a man of faith who wants to share the good news, who wants to build, you could say, the human fraternity. Um, so he's going to speak in a way that is going to invite the Sultan into the conversation. And I think the Sultan is going to do the same thing. The Sultan knows Christianity. He has Christians within the Sultanate. That's clear. But Francis is presenting his faith in a way that is familiar to the Sultan because of the Sultan's own love and admiration for the mystical traditions in Islam, and Francis really, I think, evoked for him the poetry, the voice of Muslim mystics.
Hmm. Yeah, I did not know that background of the his love for that literature, Malik al-Kamil. I mean that
Yeah,
it nor did I know about the peace deals that he offered after this meeting took place. I mean, my goodness, there's something kind of maddening about that, I mean, it maybe this language is too severe, but it's like the church was just hell bent on this genocide almost, like that he's open to giving the holy city back, and still they're saying like no, like we need to wipe you from the face of the earth. I
exactly.
mean, yeah, gosh.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Sultan, first of all, is very practical too. He's facing challenges within his own court. He's got many brothers. He's got more brothers than he needs because all of his brothers are ambitious and are looking to carve out their own kingdom from his.
Mm,
So he's kind of watching his back. He's worried about being overthrown. There was a plot to overthrow him. So he's worried about his own position within the Sultanate. And he's really his concern is really with his brothers in the remainder of the Sultanate. And so Al-Malik al-Kamil wants to bring this to a conclusion.
hmm.
He doesn't want this to drag on. He has no interest in it. There's nothing for him to gain from this conflict.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. Well, you have done an incredible job of kind of contextualizing all of this for our listeners. I mean, for me, this has taken on even more dimensions, just learning more about the Sultan's story and his actions after this meeting. And some of his, I didn't know about his affinity for Sufism. I mean, this is beautiful stuff. Now to kind of cross that bridge to today, I mean, this story has been used as a model for interreligious dialogue. It's been used as a model for peacemaking. What do you take from it with your background in Islamic studies?
I think what Francis really reflects, what Francis and the Sultan reflect for us in 1219 is something that the church would only realize with the Second Vatican Council with
Hmm.
Nostra Aetate 1965. I think there's a line that you can draw between from this marvelous encounter in 1219 to the promulgation of Nostra Aetate in 1965, because it took until 1965 for the church to finally see the goodness that exists in Islam, the commonalities that Muslims and Christians have, the common values that we share, as well as common elements in our faith.
Hmm. It's
So I
remarkable.
think, yeah, I mean, I think there's a true impact. Now, some people have looked at, and you may have heard this, some people look at Nostra Aetate and say, well, behind this are the words of Louis Massignon, who was a Franciscan tertiary as well as an Islamic scholar. So Louis Massignon has this Franciscan background. He's got a knowledge of Islam. And so we think that perhaps his voice, if not his actual words, go into Nostra Aetate and
Hmm.
really reflect for the church in the 20th century what Francis had modeled at the beginning of the 13th century.
Hmm. Yeah, you've really brought this to relevance for us on a church level. What about in an American context? I mean, we hear the words all the time about this polarized, divided time that we're navigating. Do you see this story being a benefit to the trials that we're encountering today as Americans in our dialogue and our debate?
Yeah, I think it's important. Um, And again, if we think about Francis's context, he's hearing horrible things said about Muslims. He's hearing calls for war, for violence, for murder, etc. And he's able to set that aside and enter into a personal encounter and see that person as a brother, someone who, like he, was created in the image and likeness of God and who believes in that one God. So, isn't that a struggle that so many of us face? We have to kind of shut our ears to the prejudices and the ugliness spoken by people who express hate, um, rather than people who express faith in the God who created every human being and everything in a outpouring of love. And shouldn't we then be able to see that God in the creation and in one another? I think that's really the value of this story, for not only our country but for around the world, because this kind of sectarian tension and violence is not an American problem alone. We see it around the world. I certainly see it when I travel. Um, so I think that's the value.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a tale as old as time, this rallying cry to kind of galvanize your forces around the demonization over another group of people, and the path that Francis and the Sultan took, like that is a path that you don't campaign on that path. You know what I'm saying? Like that's complex, it's nuanced, it involves relationship, it involves really seeing the goodness and beauty in one another. Yeah, I mean, in Assisi, this really struck me on my visit there. I loved how right outside the Basilica of St. Francis, there's that bell that you can ring. And around the bell is every major religious symbol in the world. And it's just yeah, it's a beautiful symbol of what this could be if we dared to see God in one another, even in people who we vehemently may disagree with.
Yeah. I think, I just taught a class on the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate, and I spoke to my students about this, and because they were really, really interested, like, how is it that after so many centuries of vitriol, on behalf of the church towards Muslims, that the church can make this transition to a much more respectful tone? And it's a very good question, but I think part of it is at least that the church was able to see and encourage the faithful to see goodness in the world. And if you see goodness in other people, you have to ask yourself, where does that goodness come from? And I think there's only one answer to that. It comes from God. If you see goodness in another person, in another faith tradition, which is what Vatican II says, the Vatican Council looks at Islam and says there is goodness here. That goodness can only have a divine source. And wow, then you really blow open your anthropology big
Yep.
time. Then you see that God, I mean, speaking in Christian terms, incarnates God's self in the world, in everyone, and in everything that is created. Now, That would resonate in Islam without the incarnation language. That would resonate in Islam because the Quran speaks about signs, that God provides humanity with signs that point to God. So, what are the signs? The creation itself. You want to know God? You will know God in some way, shape, or form simply by observing the signs of nature. The changing of night into day and day into night. The sun coming up, the clouds that sail between heaven and earth, the rain that comes down. The Quran says these are signs for a people who understand. What are other signs? The prophets. The fact that God sends prophets to humanity to teach us, to exhort us, that's a sign of God's presence with us. Divine revelation is a sign. All of these things that God sends to us are signs. We are signs to one another. If we are good people of faith, we are signs to one another. I have said that my Muslim friends will be in heaven, in paradise, in Jannah, a long time I will, because they are good and holy people. They are good and holy people. And that is ultimately the measure. How does God measure us? By what we call ourselves? Well, I may call myself a Catholic, but I may not be a very good Catholic.
Hmm.
But God will know the love in my heart for him, for my fellow human beings, for the creation. And it's on that belief, on that faith, on the way we treat one another, the way we treat every living thing, every created thing. That's the basis on which God will judge us. I firmly believe that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, what you're getting into, I mean, it makes me think of this incredible story again where it is so weird to me that in this story of Francis and the Sultan, on one level, you have religion at its worst. Religion's at war with each other, and the papacy literally calling Christian Europeans to genocide, essentially,
Mhm.
in the name of religion, in the name of God. And then in this personal, intimate encounter between the Francis and the Sultan, you have religion at its best, where you could argue that because of Francis's faith and Sultan Malik al-Kamil's faith, their ability to see goodness in one another, that faith is one of the things that help them to open their eyes to the beauty and goodness of the other. I don't really have a question there. It's just the story is just a really crazy collision to me of, well, religion has done such terrible, such evils in this world through history. True. But then you also have this encounter where their faith is making the way for something that is incredibly countercultural. I don't know. It's very
Yes.
interesting to me. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I would change your language just a little bit. Religions don't battle one another. Religions don't hate one another. It's people who claim those faith traditions
Mm, hmm.
that get into conflict.
Yeah.
Okay? I think that's a difference there. I
Yes.
think that we human beings who are flawed um express our faith better and worse. Um, we don't often reflect the fullness of our faith, uh, and we get into conflicts. But it's people who claim a faith tradition that get into faiths, not the faith traditions themselves.
Yes.
Christianity and Islam don't get into conflict with one another. People who profess to be Christians get into conflict with people who profess to be Muslims. That's the way I would describe it.
Hmm.
You know, it brings me back to one of my favorite quotes, if you will. You're probably too young to remember Bill Moyers, a great journalist who interviewed a lot of great scholars and artists, and he did an interview with Maya Angelou, the great African American poet. And he asked her what faith she followed. And she paused and she said, I aspire to be Christian.
Hmm.
Now, I thought that was the most honest answer anyone could give about their religious identity.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
aspire to be a Christian. You know, people walk around saying, I'm Christian, I'm Catholic, I'm Muslim, I'm Buddhist, I'm Hindu, I'm Sikh, whatever. Are you? Are we? Can I authentically call myself a Christian if I don't act in a Christ-like manner? That's what I'm getting to. That historically, and all religious traditions go through this, where people who are not good representatives of that faith tradition claim it a little bit too much, and then we identify that faith tradition with an imperfect expression
Hmm.
of it.
Yeah. My editor, Chris Heffron at St. Anthony Messenger, he had a question for you. And it's,
Oh,
we got into this a little bit in our conversation, but I think it's a really important aspect of the story. So, switching gears here a little bit as we conclude, his question was, how does the meeting between Francis and the Sultan inform our own internal divisions? And and I was kind of thinking about that, and it does seem to me that we can build peace outwardly, but we first have to have peace on an internal level. And I'm just wondering what this story can teach us about, how can this model that we're given in this story help to build peace in our own hearts? Because there's something really interesting happening on an individual level with Francis and the Sultan because of their own internal state and how they have taken care of their own hearts. Any thoughts there?
yeah, um, I'll speak very personally here. So, um, I am a scholar of Islam, so I'm steeped in things Islamic 24/7. Um, but not only. So I have a background in scripture, so I'm well acquainted with the Hebrew scriptures, of course, as well as the Christian scriptures, as well as the Quran. But I've also traveled quite a bit in South Asia and have seen expressions of Hinduism and Sikhism. Um, so I've had a good exposure to various religions, and I allow them all to speak to me. I allow them to become part of me in some way, shape, or form. Again, this is what the church was teaching at the Second Vatican Council, with this understanding that wherever there is good, it's got to be of God. And so my own life is enriched by people of different faiths. People get very nervous when they come up across a person from a different faith tradition. They somehow think, they're going to lose their own faith. I find that my faith is amplified and enhanced by my exposure to truly believing people, people who are good representatives of their faith tradition. I find that so enriching. And it makes me feel I feel closer to God, and I feel more appreciative, and I feel more gratitude for those experiences, for the beauty of humanity and all its diversity. I mean, we've been talking quite a bit about religion, but it need not be only about religion, but about culture in every way, shape, or form.
Mm, hmm.
My life is enriched by learning another language. My life is enriched by partaking in different cultural practices. My life is enriched by meeting people from other countries and eating different kinds of food and reading different kinds of literature. So, you know, when I think about my God, the way I think of my God, of our God, I think of a God who has poured God's self out into the creation in so many ways, so that there is nothing to prevent us from knowing that God. God has given us every avenue to know that God through the beauty and the bounty of the creation, through every created thing, and through every creative endeavor that humanity makes, through wonderful artwork, through the beauty of dance or sports for that matter. I mean, my God, we've all seen athletes and you think, wow, I mean, that is the most beautiful movement that I've ever seen, whatever sport you're talking about, right? I mean, it's easy to talk about the beauty of artwork, but when you talk about dance or some kind of athletic ability, I mean, that's representing some divine character to me. And I really think that's what faith is about. It's about opening our eyes, our hearts, our hands to the beauty in the other. Pope Francis was so good on this. He understood. God rest his soul. I get very emotional when I talk about Pope Francis because I think he was a great blessing to the church, particularly in terms of interreligious dialogue and interfaith work. And he said that the way of engaging in interreligious dialogue is to make a home for another by receiving them in love and charity and opening our hearts to the other. That's interreligious dialogue. You can't engage in interreligious dialogue if the other person is fearing you. You have to open your heart, your hands, your life, your home to the other. And I really think that comes from a place of deep faith.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Father Michael, I think that is a wonderful place for us to conclude. Anything that I left out? Anything else you wanted to hit on with this remarkable story?
I really appreciate the conversation. It's a story I love. It's the story that serves as the whole foundation for my Franciscan vocation. When I was discerning a vocation with the friars, it was this story in particular because I had experience in Islam with Muslims before, and I thought this is the foundation for my life as a friar. And it's a story that, as I said, continues to inspire me, and I believe it has the ability to inspire people of all different faith traditions.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me as well. This is the story that really, for the lack of a better term, sold me on Franciscanism because I have an evangelical background, and I just noticed that no matter what community, and there are wonderful people in these communities, and I learned a lot from my days in evangelicalism. It really actually opened up my roots in Catholicism more for me. But I did notice that in these different church communities in which I belong, there was always this drift toward certainty. And even more so these days with politics kind of filling that religious void for a lot of people. So I would notice that, again, it's just language, but conservative evangelical churches would, there was conservative political ideology permeating that space. Same thing in progressive Christianity is kind of in bed with politics at times. And not that all of that is bad either, but this story constantly invites me to see and experience Christ in the other. it completely it's a very humbling story because it completely shatters everything that you thought to be true.
Indeed.
And you're like, nope, the person who's most different than you, that's your pathway to conversion. That person's goodness, that person's faith, let them teach you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So often, particularly younger people, but not only younger people, some older Catholics as well, will ask me, in all of your time, traveling in the Middle East and elsewhere, have you converted Muslims? Um, and my point is that before I can even imagine attempting to convert anyone, I have to undergo conversion myself.
Yeah.
And I think self-conversion is the work of a lifetime.
Yes. Yeah. One of my favorite philosophers these days, his name's Peter Rollins, and he had a project in Northern Ireland, and of course they have a history there with the Troubles and everything. So
Uh-huh.
similar dynamics on display there in this story. But he would organize evangelistic teams who typically, with my evangelical background, you think you're going out to try to convert someone, but they would do the opposite. They would go out to religious communities that maybe had different beliefs than them, and they would ask the question, can you convert us? Tell us what you see when you hear the name Christian. What are we doing wrong? Like and that's my default kind of posture these days is, can I be more curious? Because
Yeah,
I've learned that the more curious I can be, the more I get to experience God's goodness and grace and beauty in the diversity of the human experience and all of humanity itself.
exactly. Exactly. And something we didn't talk about really was what scholars believe is the impact of Islam on Francis's writings beyond the rule.
Hmm.
So for example, what we call the prayer for Brother Leo, the praises of God, where Francis just gives a litany of God, you are love, you are majesty, you are holiness, you are et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Scholars look at that and say, that's a very interesting form of prayer for a Christian, and it sounds an awful lot like what we call the beautiful names of God in Islam. So people wonder if that is an influence that Francis brought with him from Islam. There's the letter that Francis writes to the rulers of the peoples. Again, this is coming right after his trip from Egypt, his return from Egypt, where he exhorts rulers to establish some way of calling people to common prayer.
Hmm.
Now, people are looking at this post Egypt and saying, this is what we call the adhan in Islam, where you have a man calling people to prayer. Because Francis says, let there be some kind of an announcement made by a messenger.
Hmm.
So, Franciscan scholars look at Francis's writings after Egypt and are able to say, these things sound an awful lot like elements from Islam,
Wow.
again, because Francis can look past the barriers and the distinctions that we set up in our minds and can see the goodness in the other.
Beautiful, my friend. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been such a joy.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Once again, that was Father Michael Calabria. You can order his book, The Language of the Taj Mahal, on Amazon or wherever books are sold. You can also watch the two-part 2012 documentary, Francis and the Sultan, on Franciscan Media's YouTube channel. I have linked to Father Michael's book, to his work, as well as to this documentary and other resources that align with this conversation in the show notes. of this episode. So, since there were no reflection segments this episode, I wanted to conclude this with a few quotes. And the first is from Nostra Aetate, the document that Father Michael referenced throughout this conversation. Quote, "Likewise, other religions found everywhere try to counter the restlessness of the human heart, each in its own manner, by proposing ways, comprising teachings, rules of life, and sacred rites. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men." End quote. Next is this quote from Thomas of Celana's biography on Francis. Quote, "One day, when Francis was asked by a certain brother why he so diligently picked up writings even of pagans, in which the name of the Lord is not mentioned, Francis replied, 'Son, whatever is good there does not pertain to the pagans, nor to any other people, but to God alone, to whom belongs every good.'" And finally, I wanted to conclude with this quote from a talk Thomas Merton gave at Calcutta in October 1968. Quote, "In the deepest level of communication is not communication, but communion. It is wordless. It is beyond words and is beyond speech and is beyond concept. Not that we discover a new unity. We discover an old unity. We discover an older unity. My dear brothers and sisters, we are already one, but we imagine that we are not. And what we have to discover is our original unity. What we have to be is what we are." End quote. Thank you as always for tuning in, for your support. Peace and all good.
I will lead you into the desert with